In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear annihilation than at any other moment in human history. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of atomic war. Missiles capable of reaching American cities sat in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy demanded their removal. Premier Khrushchev refused. The two superpowers played a deadly game of nuclear chicken, while millions of ordinary people waited to see if they would live or die. This is the story of one American family that lived through those 13 days. The Morrison family of Alexandria, Virginia, and their father, Daniel, who worked at the Pentagon and knew more than most about how close the world came to ending. Alexandria, Virginia, October 1962. Alexandria sat just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. It was a community of government workers, military families, and people whose lives revolved around the machinery of American power. The Morrison family lived in a modest brick house on Maple Avenue. Daniel Morrison worked as a civilian analyst at the Pentagon. His wife Ellen was a school teacher. Their children were David, age 15, and Anne, age 12. October began like any other autumn. Leaves turned red and gold. Children returned to school. The Morrisons settled into their usual routines. Daniel commuted to the Pentagon each morning. Ellen taught 8th grade history. David played football. Anne took piano lessons. Life felt normal and safe. But at the Pentagon, Daniel Morrison was seeing intelligence reports that terrified him. The discovery. On October 14th, an American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba took photographs that changed everything. The images showed Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles being installed at San Cristobal. These were not defensive weapons. They were offensive nuclear missiles capable of striking American cities with virtually no warning time. Daniel Morrison saw the reconnaissance photographs on October 16th. He was in a briefing room when an Air Force colonel displayed the U-2 images on a screen. The missiles were clearly visible. Launch sites under construction. Soviet technicians working on the installations. The colonel's voice remained steady as he explained what everyone in the room already understood. Nuclear weapons 90 miles from American soil. Flight time to Washington, 13 minutes. Daniel Morrison felt his stomach drop. He thought immediately of Ellen and the children, of their house in Alexandria, of how close they were to Washington. If those missiles launched, his family would have no chance, no warning, no time to run. The secret begins. President Kennedy was briefed that same day. He immediately formed a group called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm for short. They would meet in secret to decide how to respond. The American public knew nothing yet. Life continued normally while the president and his advisors debated whether the world would survive the next 2 weeks. Daniel Morrison was not part of ExComm, but his work at the Pentagon meant he knew what was happening. He knew about the missiles. He knew about the debate over military response. He knew that some generals were pushing for immediate airstrikes on Cuba. He knew that could lead to nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and he couldn't tell his family any of it. October 17th to 21st, the waiting. Daniel Morrison went home each evening and sat at the dinner table with his family. Ellen talked about her students. David complained about football practice. Anne practiced piano in the living room. Everything seemed normal. But Daniel's mind was at the Pentagon. In those briefing rooms, thinking about those missiles. Ellen noticed something was wrong. She had been married to Daniel for 17 years. She knew when he was troubled. On October 19th, after the children had gone to bed, she asked him directly, "What's going on at work? You've been different all week." Daniel wanted to tell her. He wanted to prepare her somehow, but the crisis was still classified. The public didn't know yet. He couldn't break security protocols, even for his wife. "Just a busy time," he said. "Nothing to worry about." It was a lie. Everything was worth worrying about. October 22nd, the speech. On Monday, October 22nd, President Kennedy addressed the nation on television. The Morrisons gathered in their living room at 7 o'clock. David and Anne sat on the floor. Ellen and Daniel sat on the couch. The television showed the president sitting at his desk in the Oval Office. Kennedy's voice was grave as he revealed the truth. Soviet missiles in Cuba, nuclear weapons aimed at American cities. The United States would not tolerate this threat. He announced a naval blockade. He called it a quarantine of Cuba. Any Soviet ships carrying weapons would be turned back. The missiles already in Cuba must be removed. It was a direct challenge to the Soviet Union. Either they backed down or there would be war. Anne looked at her parents with wide, frightened eyes. "Does this mean there's going to be a war?" Ellen put her arm around her daughter. "No, sweetheart, the president is handling it." But Daniel saw the fear in his wife's face. She understood what this meant. They all did. The world had just stepped to the edge of the abyss. The fear spreads. The next morning, October 23rd, panic began spreading across America. Newspapers carried headlines about the missile crisis. Radio stations broadcast constant updates. People rushed to grocery stores to stockpile food. Hardware stores sold out of supplies for fallout shelters. At Anne's school, teachers tried to maintain normalcy, but during lunch period, children gathered in anxious groups talking about nuclear war. Some students cried, others pretended not to be scared. Anne sat with her friends and listened to them discuss what would happen if the bombs fell. "My dad says we won't feel anything," one girl said. "It'll be instant." "My mom is taking us to stay with my grandparents in the country," another said. "She thinks we'll be safer away from the city." Anne went home that afternoon and asked her mother if they should leave too. Ellen Morrison didn't know how to answer. She looked to Daniel for guidance. He shook his head slightly. Where would they go? If nuclear war started, nowhere would be safe. October 23rd to 24th, the blockade. The U.S. Navy established its quarantine line around Cuba. 19 Soviet ships were heading toward the island. American warships waited to intercept them. If the Soviet vessels tried to cross the blockade line, the Navy had orders to stop them. If the Soviets refused, American ships would fire. That could trigger war. At the Pentagon, Daniel Morrison worked 18-hour days. He analyzed intelligence reports. He attended briefings. He watched as military readiness levels escalated. Strategic Air Command went to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level ever reached, one step below nuclear war. B-52 bombers carrying nuclear weapons flew continuous patrols. Missile crews stood ready to launch. The machinery of annihilation had been set in motion. It only needed the final order to execute. Daniel came home late on October the 24th. Ellen was still awake, sitting in the darkened living room. She had been listening to news radio. The Soviet ships were approaching the quarantine line. Contact would happen within hours. The world was holding its breath. "Tell me the truth," Ellen said quietly. "How bad is this?" Daniel sat beside her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke the truth he had been carrying alone for 8 days. It's as bad as it can be. If those ships don't turn around, if shooting starts, it could escalate to nuclear war within hours. And if that happens, we won't survive. None of us will. Ellen's hand found his in the darkness. They sat together in silence, listening to the radio announcer describe the Soviet ships moving closer to the American blockade. Two people who had built a life together, raised children together, faced the possibility that it could all end tomorrow. October 25th, the ships turned back. Morning came. Daniel went to the Pentagon expecting to hear that the crisis had exploded into war. Instead, he learned that the Soviet ships had stopped. They were holding position outside the quarantine line. They weren't crossing. They weren't challenging the blockade. Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously said, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. But the crisis wasn't over. The missiles already in Cuba remained. They were becoming operational. Some were already capable of launching. The clock was still ticking toward nuclear war. October 26, the letters. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and Khrushchev were exchanging messages. The Soviet premier sent a long, emotional letter on October 26. He proposed a deal. Remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island. It seemed like a way out. The crisis could end without war. At the Morrison house, the tension had become unbearable. David stopped going to football practice. Anne couldn't concentrate on homework. Ellen barely ate. Daniel came home exhausted each night, the weight of what he knew pressing down on him. On October 26th, the family sat together watching television news. Walter Cronkite reported on the diplomatic efforts. The tone was cautiously hopeful. Perhaps the worst had passed. But Daniel knew something the public didn't yet know. The military was still pushing for airstrikes. Some advisors believed Kennedy was being too soft. They wanted to attack Cuba now, destroy the missiles before they became operational. If Kennedy gave that order, Soviet forces in Cuba would respond, and then the missiles would fly. October 27, Black Saturday. October 27 would later be called Black Saturday. It was the day the world came closest to ending. That morning, a second letter arrived from Khrushchev. This one was different, harder, more demanding. He wanted the missiles removed from Cuba, but now he also demanded that the United States remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The terms had changed. The crisis had escalated again. Then the news that everyone feared arrived. A U-2 spy plane had been shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was dead. Soviet surface-to-air missiles had killed an American serviceman. The military pressure on Kennedy to retaliate became enormous. At the Pentagon, Daniel Morrison attended an emergency briefing. The mood in the room was grim. Plans for airstrikes on Cuba were being finalized. Invasion forces were assembling in Florida. The machinery of war was accelerating toward the point of no return. Daniel Morrison knew what this meant. If the United States attacked Cuba, the Soviets would respond. They had tactical nuclear weapons on the island. They might use them against an invasion force. And if tactical nuclear weapons were used, strategic weapons would follow. The nuclear exchange would begin. Hundreds of millions would die, maybe billions. Civilization might not survive. He thought about Ellen, about David and Anne, about their house on Maple Avenue, about everything they had built together. All of it would vanish in nuclear fire. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The longest night. Daniel Morrison came home that evening and found his family watching television. The news was reporting the downing of the U-2. Analysts were discussing the likelihood of military action. The fear in the house was palpable. David spoke first. "Dad, are we going to die?" It was a direct question. Daniel looked at his 15-year-old son, at his 12-year-old daughter, at his wife, and he decided they deserved the truth. "I don't know," he said quietly. "The situation is very serious. Decisions are being made right now that will determine whether there's a war. If there is, if nuclear weapons are used, then yes, we probably won't survive." Anne started crying. Ellen pulled her close. David's face went pale, but he didn't cry. He was trying to be brave. "What do we do?" Ellen asked. "We stay together," Daniel said. "Whatever happens, we face it together." That night, the Morrison family didn't go to bed. They stayed in the living room, all four of them, listening to the radio, waiting for news, waiting to learn if they would see another morning. Daniel held Ellen's hand. David sat close to his father. Anne curled up against her mother. They talked about memories, about happy times, about the life they had shared. If these were their last hours, they would spend them together. October 28th, the message, morning came. The Morrisons were still in the living room, exhausted, frightened, but alive. At 9 o'clock, Radio Moscow broadcast a message. It was from Khrushchev. He announced that Soviet missiles in Cuba would be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. The crisis was over. The Morrisons heard the announcement on their radio. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The words didn't seem real. They had lived for 13 days, expecting nuclear war, and suddenly it was over. The world had stepped back from the edge. Ellen started crying. David laughed, a sound of pure relief. Anne hugged her mother tightly. Daniel Morrison sat very still, feeling the weight of 13 days lifting from his shoulders. The world had survived. His family had survived. Tomorrow would come after all. The aftermath. Life returned to normal slowly. Schools continued. People went back to work. The crisis faded from the front pages as other news took its place. But for those who had lived through it, October 1962 left permanent scars. Daniel Morrison never spoke publicly about how close the world had come to ending. The classified information he knew remained classified, but he carried the knowledge with him always. He knew that nuclear war had been averted, not by wisdom or careful planning, but by luck, by leaders who, at the final moment, chose survival over pride. The Morrison family changed after October 1962. They held each other closer. They didn't take ordinary moments for granted. They understood, in a way most people didn't, how fragile civilization was, how quickly everything could end. Years later, David Morrison became a history teacher. He taught his students about the Cuban Missile Crisis. He explained how close the world came to nuclear war. His students listened politely, but didn't really understand. To them, it was just history. They couldn't imagine living through those 13 days, not knowing if tomorrow would come. Anne Morrison became a peace activist. She worked for nuclear disarmament organizations. She spoke at rallies and conferences about the dangers of nuclear weapons. She told people about October 1962, about what it felt like to be 12 years old and think the world was ending. Most people nodded sympathetically, but didn't really grasp it. They hadn't been there. Ellen Morrison lived until 2001. She died never having forgotten those 13 days. In her final years, she told her grandchildren about October 1962, about sitting in the living room with her family, waiting to see if nuclear war would start. The grandchildren listened but couldn't quite comprehend. To them, it seemed like ancient history. Daniel's testimony. Daniel Morrison lived until 2015. He was 91 years old when he died. In his final years, he agreed to be interviewed about the Cuban Missile Crisis for a documentary project. It was one of the few times he spoke publicly about what he knew. The interviewer asked him what October 1962 had taught him. Daniel Morrison thought for a long time before answering. "It taught me that we're not as smart as we think we are," he said finally. "We built these weapons that could destroy the world. We put them in the hands of men who could launch them in minutes, and then we nearly used them because neither side wanted to appear weak. We almost ended human civilization over pride." The interviewer asked if he thought another crisis like that could happen again. Daniel Morrison's face grew grave. "It could happen tomorrow," he said. "The weapons still exist, thousands of them. The systems are still in place. And human nature hasn't changed. We're still capable of the same mistakes, the same miscalculations. The only thing that saved us in 1962 was luck. And luck runs out." The lesson. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. For 13 days, the world balanced on the edge of nuclear annihilation. Ordinary people went to work, sent their children to school, lived their lives while secretly wondering if each day might be their last. The crisis ended not because of great wisdom or careful planning, but because two men, Kennedy and Khrushchev, chose at the final moment to step back from the abyss. They chose survival over victory. They chose their children's future over their own pride. But the weapons that nearly destroyed the world in 1962 still exist. Thousands of nuclear warheads remain on alert, ready to launch within minutes. The missiles that can end civilization sit in silos and submarines, waiting for orders that could come at any time. The danger hasn't passed. It has only been deferred. Closing. This is Daniel Morrison's story. This is his witness to October 1962. This is what it meant to live through the 13 days when the world almost ended. To work at the Pentagon and know how close nuclear war was. To sit with your family in the living room and wonder if you would see another morning. To survive by luck and be forever changed by the knowledge of how fragile everything is. The Cuban Missile Crisis taught a generation that civilization exists on a knife's edge, that the ordinary world we take for granted can vanish in an instant, that the weapons we build can destroy not just our enemies, but ourselves. Daniel Morrison carried that knowledge for more than 50 years. He never forgot October 1962. He never forgot the fear. He never forgot how close they came. And he never stopped worrying that it could happen again, because the weapons still exist. The systems are still in place. And human nature hasn't changed. The world survived once. It may not survive a second time.